Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for making time this Tuesday afternoon. If I could just ask anybody who isn't on mute to mute, that would be spectacular. And certainly we invite you to turn on your cameras. It's lovely to see your faces. So please feel free to do that. Not necessary, but feel free. So again, thank you for making time this Tuesday afternoon to join the Environmental Media Lab and our first graduate scholar in residence, Madeleine Mendell. I'm Crystal Choksey, and I'm Associate Director at the lab, which is based at the University of Calgary. And one of the things that I like best about working with this group is that our director, Mel Hogan, is constantly creating opportunities to uplift junior scholars. We launched the Graduate Scholar in Residence program last month, and its chief aims are to give graduate students a dedicated audience to engage with their work and to help them develop a new, meaningful network. We feel really fortunate to have had Maddie with us and to have been a part of her academic journey over the last several weeks. So Madeleine Mendell graduated from Columbia University with a BA in Film and Media Studies. She's right now pursuing her MA in Moving Image Archiving and Preservation at New York University. Maddie is going to speak with us today about her thesis research, DNA as Data Storage. She says that, like others writing about DNA, she is drawn to the ways in which DNA exists in our public imaginary and how its physical structures can either support or negate those metaphors. Approaching discourses surrounding DNA with a lens guided by archival studies, where maintenance of objects can generate as much or more information than the objects themselves, Maddie says she's uniquely located to explore these exciting new topics. Maddie shared with me before this very moment that she is super grateful for your being here and for this opportunity to share her work and get some feedback, we hope. So following Maddie's talk, which will be about 20-25 minutes, we'll reserve about 10 to 15 for a Q&A with the overall goal of supporting her work and where she is right now. So everyone, thank you again for being here. Maddie, thank you for this, and over to you.
Wow, thank you so much for that very effusive introduction. Hi, I'm Madeleine Mendell. As Crystal said, I'm a second-year master's student at the New York University's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation program. And I'm also very, very excited to be the Environmental Media Lab's first graduate scholar in residence. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen right now. It's always a moment of anticipation. Can everyone see that? Cool. Okay. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape and Carnacy peoples. I also want to acknowledge that given the content of this talk, coincidentally, today is Australia Day, which is also called Invasion Day or Day of Mourning as a counter celebration to that nationalist holiday. In this remote age where we're all presumably at home and physically isolated from our institutions, I hope we can all think about our individual relationships to the people whose land we occupy and in whose histories that we participate. I want to thank my thesis advisor and director of EML, Mel Hogan, and Crystal for their incredible support and guidance. This paper, which is a presentation of the work in progress research I've been doing over the past month, is titled Australia's DNA, Material and Metaphor of a New Data Storage Format in the National Archive. And while I hope my thesis proper will contend more with the technical specifications of synthetic DNA, as well as its future applications into archival and librarian workflows, I want to spend this time thinking with you about the other side of this project, which considers the ethical questions that we as archivists and researchers must reconcile as this new format becomes a viable option for the storage of cultural heritage materials. Much of my previous research has focused on hand processing for film or media microservices for digital workflows, so I really look forward to your questions and feedback for this talk. I also want to briefly mention that my slideshow does contain one image that depicts the violent history of colonization in Australia, and I will give another trigger warning for that. So why did I pick this topic? On September 25th of this past year, a few months ago, I saw a press release from the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia which is a national archive funded by the government. In it, they, along with their partner, the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage, proudly announced that they were the first to preserve a film onto DNA. And I just say preserve because preservation should imply access, and media stored on DNA isn't really accessible at this point unless you have thousands of dollars. But regardless, the NFSA is the first national cultural heritage institution to have sourced the funds for a pilot project to store a video onto DNA. And this was intriguing enough. Then watching their press video, which you can watch online, the language the now former CEO of the NFSA, Jan Muller, was using to describe this process, and more specifically, the video he had picked really struck me. So the NFSA chose the footage of Aboriginal Australian athlete Kathy Freeman winning the 400-meter race at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. Selected presumably because of the collaboration with the OFCH and the funding dynamics, this moment holds a really great importance in the cultural memory of Australia. Freeman, who self-identifies as a proud Kuku Yalanji woman, was the first Aboriginal athlete to win the gold medal at an individual event. And what interested me was the way that Muller describes this footage as an iconic moment which has metaphorically become part of Australia's DNA, is now stored on actual DNA. And it was this confluence of metaphor and material, Australia's DNA and actual DNA, used as a justification for this curatorial choice that really struck me. The metaphoric power of DNA is often harnessed to connect cultural or ancestral heritage to conceits of nation and race using scientific jargon. And here, with the materiality of DNA very present, its nucleotides, however synthetic, are tied physically to the actual imagery of Kathy Freeman. This metaphor cannot be dissociated from the very real and ongoing histories of the fraught management of Indigenous materials in the National Archive, which itself is a continuation of this colonizing project. So without a self-reflection and without change, archives are liable to perpetuate these histories of violence anew and now inscribed onto synthetic genetic material. So here's a little roadmap so I don't get lost. I want to start with a discussion of Kathy Freeman's own role as an athlete activist in Australia, especially in the decade leading up to her iconic victory lap in 2000, and how the Australian politics at the time shaped her role in reconciliation and the larger history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander civil rights movements, in order to understand this metaphor of Australia's DNA. And then in an effort to tie material to metaphor, I looked to the ways settler states have handled the genetic material of Indigenous people in Australia, as well as in the Americas, as a way of understanding how DNA itself, synthetic or not, is imbued with these histories and complexes of racism and colonization. And lastly, I want to finish with some open-endedness as I ask how archives can contend not only with these biases that are a part of genomics, but also a part of the technologies of storage and care for cultural objects. Okay, so this is an image of the Sydney Opera House, which the NFSA projected this footage on as a way of celebrating their accomplishment. And in choosing this footage, the NFSA, whether they intended to or not, has made a very political decision to champion this moment as emblematic of all Australia, in contrast to other Black Indigenous athletes, including at times Freeman herself, who made proclamations of their race and heritage at athletic events. Freeman carrying both the Aboriginal and Australian flags during her victory lap was described as bringing the nation together, both in contemporary press and 20 years later in the NFSA's press release. In framing her victory lap as a nation-building moment that unified the country at a time of immense political and social discord between Indigenous Australians and the settler government, the NFSA has reinforced a narrative that belies the complexity of the Sydney Olympics and the politic of reconciliation it championed. In the decade leading up to her win in 2000, Freeman not only trained as an athlete, but also as an Aboriginal activist, wielding her growing fame to raise consciousness for the struggles and histories of her ancestors in the national and international arenas. And her activism over those years show various successes and failures with respect to the approval of her white audiences and government, as well as in contrast to contemporary Black and Indigenous athletes. In In the background of her rising career during the 90s, there were immense changes in Australia regarding the legal, political, and social status of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Freeman's activism shows that these changes were not in her personal background, and her actions demonstrate her intention to push her heritage, her ancestors, and their relationship to Australia into the foreground of her public image. So I list here some of the major events, both in Freeman's athletic career and in Aboriginal Australian relations. In the years leading up to her victory lap in 2000, Freeman also performed similar actions that were celebrated by the public, forgotten in the imaginary, or condemned by the state. What is consistent, though, is the way that the media and government outlets continued to frame Freeman's activism as naive and her as unaware of her own politics. However, Freeman's career reveals quite the opposite. She sought to bring the Aboriginal flag and the people into the sports arena and therefore into the public as a form of resistance and representation. In early competitions, Freeman wore the Aboriginal flag motif as an ornament on her headbands, and then she later wore it on her wristbands to be more subtle. In a 1994 meet that foreshadows her victory lap in 2000, she won the 400 meter at the Commonwealth Games in Canada, and took first a victory lap with only the Aboriginal flag. And then in a second lap, picked up the Australian flag. The Australian media and government jumped at this action and excoriated it as unpatriotic. So a couple of days later, when she won the 200 meter, she picked up both flags at the same time. And that moment became Kathy's uniting double. These images of Freeman holding both Aboriginal and Australian flags were lauded by the wider Australian public. It was when she neglected Australia, the nation, that she got into trouble or was ignored. That same year, Freeman devised another stunt and creation of an iconic photograph, which has since faded almost completely from the public imaginary. And I do want to reiterate my trigger warning from earlier. In this image, she staged herself in front of a mural by the Aborigines Advancement League, which depicts a 1906 photograph of Aboriginal elders in chains. Here, Freeman runs in front of the image of Australia's colonial past in a present where inequity between white settlers and Aboriginals is rampant. She makes that violent history very much a part of the present, which is what Australian reconciliation sought to move past. In this image, there is no denial of the past, in favor of a bright future. This photograph, which was quickly reprinted without the original context, has more or less disappeared from the cultural memory. So in these analyses of how the International Olympic Committee determines which actions are appropriate and which are not, Christine O'Bonswin writes, there exist decisive manifestations that continue to privilege the interests of colonial nation states that are responsible for the historic sufferings and ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples. Actions condoned or even facilitated by nation states represented by Black and Indigenous athletes may be similar to ones condemned by those same entities. This hypocrisy defines athletic activism as uneasy, something that cannot rely on precedents set by previous athletes for standards of what is approved of and what is not. Freeman, because of her gender, perhaps because of her sport, was framed as shy and naive, unlike contemporaries who engaged in similar work. Freeman's imagery is often compared to the famous image of Nicky Winmar stating, "I'm Black and I'm proud to be Black," which was made in response to racist remarks on the football green. Not coincidentally, the same photographer took these two pictures, which is partially what prompted Freeman to hire him to stage the picture on the left. More recently, in 2012, boxer Damien Hooper faced disciplinary charges from the Australian Olympic Committee for wearing a shirt embroidered with the Aboriginal flag, which is basically the same action carried out by Freeman in 2000. The IOC and AOC cited Rule 50, which forbids any kind of political, religious, or racial demonstration inside an Olympic venue. And this hypocrisy begs the question, why was Freeman allowed to pick up both the Aboriginal and Australian flags in 2000 and run around the stadium with them? Leading up to the Olympics, Australia was facing potential boycotts, a report from the UN CERD criticizing the treatment of Indigenous Australians, and large marches protesting the lack of a formal apology from the government for the stolen generations, a period during which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, including Freeman's own kin, were forcibly removed from their families. The country then found itself in 2000 on the international stage hosting the Olympics. Freeman was constantly depicted as a non-participant in her own activism, despite her releasing a statement that year deriding the government's claims that the stolen generations was non-existent. The Olympics propagandized Freeman as a, quote, symbol that stood for both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians. Obonswin writes that in the Olympic domain, Indigenous athletes have to accept the identity of a colonizing settler citizenry, thereby further validating the political authority of an illegally imposed governing structure. Only when it was necessary for Australia to acknowledge the indigeneity of its representative athletes in order to move past its colonizing history was it appropriate for the Aboriginal flag to enter the sports arena. Cathy Freeman is an athlete who consistently engages in the painful colonizing past of Australia and its treatment of her people in order to bring that past into the present. The Australian government and now National Archive have subsumed the power of her actions into the state-approved message of running for all Australia, which purposefully negates and whitewashes her Aboriginal activism specificity. So why am I engaging in this extended discussion of Cathy Freeman and her imagery's afterlife in the public imaginary 20 years after her gold medal win? Just as archivists are the stewards for the physical longevity of materials, we must also consider the way our preservation strategies and decisions affect those items. Running for all Australia is what metaphorically became part of Australia's DNA. Here exists a double meaning. Australia's DNA is not only the metaphoric cultural memory of history, colonialism, violence, reconciliation, but also the genetic makeup of Australia, Indigenous and not. These two understandings of DNA, of memory and material intersect to create a narrative of subsuming Indigenous DNA into the history and project of Australia, the nation's DNA. DNA is, so move on to the second part. And I'm gonna have a little sip of water. DNA is not a storage format that indiscriminately carries its contents. It'd be hard to argue that any storage format does. Because of its metaphorical inheritance, its structure has been imbued with the weighty sentiment that, like a sidecar metadata file, it vouches that the content is worth being contained by DNA. This implication that the essence of material qualifies its treatment is pernicious and echoes the histories of archival abuse and exclusion of Indigenous materials. The use of the DNA metaphor in the national context perpetuates how settler states selectively include and exclude Indigenous people and experiences at their convenience. So in this section, I want to examine the relationship between scientific genomics projects and Indigenous populations. By confronting this metaphor, blank is the DNA of blank, with the material commodification of Indigenous DNA. I want to examine how the National Archives of settler states must contend with the racial and colonizing projects imbued into genomics that will reappear when cultural heritage is stored onto DNA. So this is an image of the actual file of DNA in front of the National Film and Sound Archive. In their decision to store Cathy Freeman's Victory Lap onto DNA, the NFSA and OFCH, as well as their Silicon Valley tech partner Twist Bioscience, have brought DNA data storage into the realm of critical race and Indigenous studies. And this is an opportunity for archives to engage in questions of how these colonial social structures are embedded in DNA data storage formats at their inception. DNA, synthetic or biological, retains a double helical structure that has accumulated 50 years of genetic research and bioethics into our understanding of what DNA is. And here I want to understand the ways the metaphor of DNA and the material of DNA work together to produce a colonial paradigm that subsumes indigeneity into a national and colonizing project at its convenience. So I've primarily drawn from Kim Talbert and Jenny Reardon's research on the use of Indigenous genetic material as a raw resource by the Genographic Project. And then I focus more specifically on the treatment of the 9,000-year-old Kennewick man whose skeletal remains were discovered in Washington State about 20 years ago. So the Genographic Project was a privately funded research endeavor founded in 2005 And it's failed, so the Genographic Project and its failed predecessor, the Human Genome Project, sought to trace human migratory paths back to Africa. Spencer Wells, the lead researcher for the project, claimed we are all African under the skin, which does feel really dated 15 years later, and felt dated then probably as well, which highlights the goals of proving that we humans all come from the same place. In order to find that common ancestor, the project solicited blood samples from highly unadmixed people or isolated indigenous populations. These claims of anti-racism are rife in the Genographic Project's literature. They claim genomics can prove racism is scientifically incorrect. However, the project relies heavily on constructions of indigeneity and racial purity that are liable to undermine legal claims to identity and rights when considered in isolation from traditional knowledge and treaties. Moreover, at the core of the project, as well as his belief that while indigenous people have their traditions, oral histories, and creation myths, white Europeans like himself only have science. Quote, we use science to tell us about origin stories because we, being the white European, don't have the sense of direct continuity. Our ancestors didn't pass down the stories, we've lost them, and we have to go out and find them. We use science, which is a European way of looking at the world, to do that. In repurposing this language of exploration, Wells affirms that white Europeans like himself must search for their origin story, which can only be accomplished through the use of the resource that is the indigenous genetic material. Under the guise of self-described anti-racism, the Genographic Project sought to create a white origin myth through the dissection, co-option, and exploitation of indigenous DNA. Kim Tolbert describes Wells as perpetuating the familiar position of a white European making a moral claim on the natural resources of indigenous peoples. The cultural value Wells sees in indigeneity is crucial to his belief that white Europeans deserve the same, and therefore becomes justification for mining their genetic resource. The triumphant metaphor of Australia's DNA points to the subsumption of indigenous accomplishment and existence into a nation-building narrative, while biological anthropologists continue to value studying and understanding whiteness and believe that a study of redness is constitutive part of this project. Just as the AOC selectively picked representations of indigeneity that would benefit the terms of reconciliation most favorable for Australia, the nation, biological anthropologists too have a history of wielding their power to decide when it is appropriate for us all to be African under the skin and when to respect the rights of isolated indigenous populations. There are too many examples of the misuse of indigenous genetic material by large settler institutions that violate tribes and individuals' consent. I've just listed some screenshots from the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism of quote, genetic vampirism that is deemed a form of colonization. The long history of medicalized violations against tribal nations accompanies the anthropological research of these tribes' materials and bodies, while the US Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, of 1990 attempts to remediate these relationships between American cultural heritage and research institutions and federally recognized tribal nations through repatriation. The case of the Kennewick Man demonstrates how DNA becomes a tool by which scientists and governments can continue to decide selectively whether to adhere to these laws. So I wanted to focus on the Kennewick Man for a variety of reasons that will become apparent, but what initially drew me to discussing the ancient one, the Kennewick Man, and the ensuing legal issues is the way that the extraction of DNA of ancient corpses was used by Muller as a way of proving that DNA data storage will last for at least a couple thousand years. His evocation of Ötzi, a body found in the Swiss Alps, resonates in this discussion of the legal battle over the burial and research of the Kennewick Man. So in 1996, two students found the 9,000-year-old skeletal remains of a man, now known as the Kennewick Man, in Washington State. Invoking NAGPRA, several Columbia River Basin Indian tribes and bands demanded to repatriate and bury the bones before they could be researched by biological anthropologists. I won't really get into it, but in a 2014 Smithsonian Magazine review of the book written by the researchers, Preston wrote of the ensuing legal fight that if it weren't for a harrowing round of panicky last-minute maneuvering worthy of a legal thriller, the remains might have been buried and lost to science forever. Pretty succinctly, Preston demonstrates how the mostly white scientific community lauded the maneuvering of both legal loopholes and scientific know-how to invade the claims made by the tribal nations that were made in order to protect their religious freedom and tribal rights. This phrase, lost to science forever, echoes the language of urgency described by the Genographics Project's efforts to capture indigenous DNA before populations became too mixed. And ultimately, the scientists won their lawsuit on the basis that the bones could not possibly be related to a living tribe, a claim which was supplemented by a forensic anthropologist's claims that the bones did not even appear Native American. In other words, the ancient one was not indigenous enough, despite predating colonization by several millennia. The court made decisions based on settler notions of ancestry and cultural heritage, which are rooted in anthropological bioscience, opposed to religious beliefs of the tribal nations claiming the remains of their ancestor. Instead, scientists fit the Kennewick man into the narrative of a Bering Strait migration, attaching him not to the indigenous people who reside on his resting place, but instead to a mysterious people who have long since disappeared. In the framework of Tallbear and Reardon's analysis of whiteness as property, they say claims by Native Americans to a property interest in their own biological materials and history often are viewed as an obstruction of the original or current distribution of power, property, and resources that are the result of right and merit. The value of indigenous genetic material is only apparent when it contributes to dogmatic settler scientific norms, and when that genetic material cannot conform, it must not be indigenous. While DNA tests at the time were not possible on the Kennewick man, technological developments have allowed for DNA analysis. And in 2017, after sourcing DNA from the Colville tribes, which involved a lot of discussion of consent, the Kennewick man was finally repatriated and buried in 2017. In her analysis of the way NAGPRA clumsily juggles settler notions of race, culture, and science with tribal ones, Tallbear analyzes how the requirement of establishing cultural affiliation can become impossible when acknowledging the shifting definitions of race and the history of colonization in the Americas that have profoundly distorted and changed definitions of belonging and difference. That is not to mention the diverse contemporary membership roles of the over 350 federally recognized tribes in the United States that do not require a DNA test or a forensic anthropologist to analyze bone structure. Tallbear argues that knowing the Kennewick man walked North America 8,500 years prior to European colonization is the indisputable fact. The genetic links between the Kennewick man and Native Americans and non-Native Americans cannot dispute that fact. However, as she notes in an article published after the Kennewick man's DNA was sequenced, science shares with the law and with white people in general the power to define and ultimately police race. So NAGPRA, the scientific community, and the settler state require tribal nations to operate within white narratives and methodologies consistently in order to prove their rights. Ultimately, the DNA sequencing of the Kennewick man is completely irrelevant to the incontrovertible fact that he existed in North America before colonization. However, the legal fight over his remains demonstrates how genetic research that seeks to unravel indigenous origin stories in order to create white ones is also used to challenge indigenous rights to land, to body, and to history. DNA is a tool that has been used consistently to reinforce settler understandings of indigeneity in order to reinforce conceptualizations of race that prioritize whiteness. As a metaphor, these same systems of abuse accomplish the same task. At the settler state's convenience, the metaphor of DNA can seamlessly absorb indigenous narratives that benefit the state while dismissing and denying the ones that don't. So I wanted to leave you and myself, because this is a work in progress and I'm still figuring out where I want to take this, with questions that I'm still trying to answer. And I don't know, we can go to a Q&A or something. But I'm thinking about how the archive, which should adhere to Indigenous protocols of how to handle Indigenous materials, can contend with the colonizing structures embedded into DNA, and in what ways can DNA inform us of how other technologies are saddled with these structures and what, and then I stole this one from Crystal, but what are the stakes of media metaphors? And that's kind of where I'm still thinking.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Maddie. Give you a virtual round of applause here. Thank you for that talk. You've been so generous to give us some questions to think about. And I also wonder if anybody else wants to respond either to these or with maybe your own impressions, something you noticed. If anybody wants to just unmute yourself and feel free to share anything as unstructured as it might feel.
Or put something in the chat.
For that too, exactly. And tell us where you're from, because it's lovely to see people from all over joining us. So that is also nice to hear. Well, people are thinking, Maddie, I want to come back to these questions because I think they're really well put. But I wondered if you could just speak for just a minute more on this phrase you said, which is DNA doesn't indiscriminately carry its contents. Obviously you've spoken at length about this, but if you could just say a few more words about that kind of that word indiscriminate to me is so key.
Yeah, I've been really thinking through this essay by Zoe Sophia about container technologies. And I think that's kind of where I want to move the conversation. But there's always this evocation of repositories or resources, which in archival language always implies that there is an intellectual and physical control element, and that there is someone maintaining that. And so thinking about storage, there's always a level of maintenance. And so there's always someone who has to maintain that information, especially when it comes to repositories and resources. And that maintenance can come in the form of migration, but it can also come in the form of description and metadata. And in that way, a storage format is never going to be indiscriminate. It always is imbued with these methodologies from archiving that is a field that is trying to contend with its own colonizing history. But when it doesn't, it only perpetuates that. So I think that's what I was trying to get at.
Thank you for that. I know I have a million follow-up questions, but I'm famous for this, so I'm going to take the breath and invite other people to share their thoughts, impressions, what you noticed, or maybe something that might have got you thinking about. Like I said, even if it's not a fully fledged.
I can also stop screen sharing if that's annoying.
Either way, or you can keep it up because that's your questions on it. Yeah, no.
I have a question. Thank you so much for that talk. It's amazing. I've seen sort of a few iterations of this, and every time I'm just and there's more to it, and it's really fantastic. I guess I'm just wondering, I know there's a few sort of people in this that are interested in the sort of archival questions more specifically, and you talked a lot about the metaphor here, and I wonder if you want to say a bit more about the material. I think maybe it's not super obvious to people what we mean when we say that we're storing stuff onto DNA, right? What's is there a relationship to binary code? How are things put onto DNA, and how is that even imagined to be a kind of archival medium or format? So just maybe a little bit more on the material.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. This chapter isn't really focusing on that, and so I've left a lot of that out, which in giving this, I'm oh, that's and also something that was frustrating for me, because in that original press video and then the subsequent talk that was given by the NFSA, it was full of these metaphors used to describe how it actually worked. And I don't have a screenshot of it in the slide, but I do have one where, all of these archivists are asking, is it interoperable? Are you using open source formats? And all of these questions. So that's really at the forefront of my mind. But in essence, the data stream is converted into a binary sequence, which is then converted into the 4 nucleotides, which is then sequenced onto a synthetic silicone-based DNA, which then resides in that little vial that I had a picture of. And the data's density is really really impressive. So a single vial can hold, I think it's upwards of a petabyte of information, which has a lot of ramifications because of the need for data storage at that level. The issues come from the lack of interoperability and the lack of being able to actually maintain the DNA once it's on in this file. There's not really much you can do with it. And there's also no random access memory. So at this point, you can't extract individual files. You would have to resequence the entire petabyte of information, which is not, doesn't really help at all. So there's still like a lot of technological developments that need to be made in order to make DNA data storage a viable format. And I think this pilot project was really meant to, if I can speak candidly, put NFSA on the map in terms of their press. And in their presentation at EMEA, which is the Association for Moving Image Archivists conference, all they could speak to was the amount of press that they had generated. And they couldn't speak to the actual technological implications of DNA data storage. So that's where we're at now. I think it's definitely in the future going to become something that is looked at more seriously. And there's a lot of investment from the tech community and from governments into the researching how to make it a viable format.
Thanks for that, Maddie. You said something else that you brought up this kind of commonplace, like lost to science forever. And it like my mind is constantly boggled with how many commonplaces I just keep taking for granted, even though I'm in critical media studies and should not be so ignorant anymore. But I wonder if you've come across any more of these, or if you just want to share any kind of reflections on just this lost to science discourse, maybe something else you've noticed kind of discursively, in archival studies that, maybe you took for granted. I don't know, just a kind of any type of response to this kind of lost to science forever discourse that you've raised, or maybe other people on watching want to share their thoughts on these kind of discourses that they've noticed as well and get exploded. That's one for anybody.
I mean, we had this reading group on Twitter last week, and one of the questions I asked was like, what are the metaphors that haunt you in your research? Oh, Amanda. I'll get to that in a sec. But I think in archives, and I see this kind of debate a lot, is this idea that something was discovered in the archive, which is really contentious, and there's so much writing about it, and then there's writing about it, and I don't really want to get into it, but that is one of the reasons why I did pursue this degree, was this idea that that things that are in the archive are already there, and were put there by someone, whether or not they were, they have been processed and remain to be discoverable. But that's something that I'm definitely trying to wrap my head around, and then I see people jumping into that debate, and I'm like, I don't want to get involved. There's a question from Amanda, who was in a class with me last semester, which was very formative and helped me develop this. So it's good to see you. That asks, somewhat along the lines of this last question, is reproduction of the storage something being considered? Or is it something only envisaged as manually individual inscription at this point? That's definitely there. And I think the other part of DNA data storage that is fascinating to people is the fact that it can be replicated. There's still a very high error rate that doesn't necessarily make it viable. But it's definitely also part of this imaginary as something that can persist without human intervention, which is also completely counterintuitive to the doctrine of maintenance in the archive, which has also been something frustrating to contend with.
Thanks for that, Maddie. Anybody else want to submit a comment via chat or just go for it? Oh, Tessa, is that you?
Hello, yes, hi.
Hi,
I have something rather half-baked. Let's see if it comes out even remotely coherent. So I'm thinking about there's something interesting in the way in which so this imagined context in which sort of there is this sort of like lack of origin myths that is some great sort of like loss to white people is well, it seems to really reflect the degree to which cultural assumptions sort of like within our society do so much work to render sort of like our culture is sort of like invisible in a sense, so that you can come in and say, oh yes, well, we don't have any of these wonderful sort of origin myths, which is simply false. But then on top of that, you have this drive to kind of cannibalize the myths of other cultures and sort of absorb them and take them over, which then I think you can see that becoming even more like, well, you can see it being intensified in this push to, in fact, claim not just their stories and their history, but their actual bodies and their DNA. So there's something really interesting to me in that, in this sort of like this urge to consume that we seem to sort of like not really be able to get away from in these contexts, and especially coming from people who are ostensibly and who would claim to be anti-racist, and yet, yeah, I don't know. These are my thoughts, and I don't know if you have anything to like say about any of them, but yeah, it's a fascinating kind of I don't know, escalation.
Yeah, reading about that project is overwhelming on a lot of levels. And I really recommend reading Kim Tallbear's book, Native American DNA. She gets a lot more into it than I think I have the time for. But something that your comment brought up for me is the other kind of metaphor used for DNA is that it's the code for life. And that has a lot of, I think, implications in terms of like it being operable or being able to do something with it, but also that life can be reduced to a data stream. Really evokes this dataism that kind of does the same thing to these non-white cultures, of reducing things to a stream of data in order to dissect them and understand them and reveal them in a way that is not searching for the right word, but in a way that just, yeah, cannibalizes them, and it further otherizes non-white cultures in a way that is just reflective of how those systems, like of the histories of those systems and the violence of them.
Thanks, Jessa. I see Deb Verhoeven has put a comment in there too. Do you want to read it, Vanny, or do you want to read it?
I can read it. Comment about the NFSA. So I'll just read it. I think you know my problem with the NFSA project when you raise metaphor in your title. Race is also a metaphor. The idea that Kathy Freeman now runs forever suggests that the NFA wished to provide a context in which that race and racing at the Darwinian level needs to be durable and perhaps actively perpetuated. Yeah, there's this idea in preservation that you're capturing a moment forever and kind of making it live forever. And that was also, but the context that you put that moment in tells the future what to think of that moment. And that was one of the biggest issues I had with the way that they were describing that. Hi, Claire. I like your second question, how asking how DNA's embedded social structures might raise awareness of how these same structures might apply to other technologies. I'm wondering, are there other particular technologies that you have in mind when you ask this question, or any particular technologies you'd like to explore? So as I mentioned at the beginning, like a lot of my research last year and in my undergrad was on film like material and on hand processing and alternative processing for film. And I'm particularly interested in the way that these same structures are embedded into film. And I think maybe the most obvious way of looking at that is skin tone and in color film, which has been talked a lot about at the academic level and then also at the archival level of how to preserve and restore specific film stocks that fade, or even film stocks that use different color cards for people of color. So that's something. And then also in terms of computing, I think Tara McPherson has a really great history of kind of the way that racial structures and gender structures are imbued into computing. So that's something else that I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Maddie. I think we're at time there. So I'll just thank everybody again. Maddie, especially thank you for your work and being willing to do this today. Thank you everyone for making time this Tuesday afternoon / evening / early morning, wherever you are in the world. And we hope you'll join us again in the future. Have a great afternoon, evening, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Maddie.
Good job, Maddie.